Skeleton Crew by Paul Finch. Read by Rula Lenska.
The fact that John Stroud, a professional stick-up man and deranged killer, had escaped that day did not exactly fill the relief section sergeant with enthusiasm for night turn. Lucy Amston had 16 productive years in the job. Being a female officer, she'd had to get used to direct challenges, and now took great pride in her mental and physical toughness. Even she would admit, however, that the thought of a man like John Stroud on the loose was unnerving. He'd busted out of Pentonville that afternoon, taking the lives of 2 prison guards in the process. With the National APB out for him and tactical support units on a constant 24-hour sweep, everyone reckoned he'd be on his way to some safe house by now, with a view to leaving the country as soon as possible. Lucy knew Stroud, though. She also knew that on this night of the week in particular, Wednesday, the subdivision would have its lowest overnight staffing level. And it was this Nick, of all Nicks, that John Stroud had a particular bone to pick with. Because this insignificant little East End manor was the place where he'd finally been run to ground and subsequently sent away for 6 life sentences. Not by the uniform reliefs, of course, but by a special firearms team set up for the job. Somewhat inevitably, though, those monkeys were no longer around. Ages back, they'd been dispersed to their units, leaving somebody else to cop it. Which was what worried Lucy. Aside from Sergeant Claymore in the custody suite, there'd be 1 man on the front desk and only 3 others on patrol. And that would be it. A regular skeleton crew. CAD was located in the divisional HQ 8 miles away. Night crime would be on call, but had 2 other subdivisions to patrol, while traffic and dogs would also be spread thinly over a much wider area than usual. And the duty officer was on leave. If only the underworld knew. What if they did know? What if John Stroud knew? Lucy tried to play things down as she briefed everyone in the parade room at 5 minutes to 10. What there was of the relief wasn't exactly ideal for this sort of crisis. Jerry Taylor had huge jug ears and a foolish grin, which made him look less like a police constable than anyone else she'd ever seen. Invariably, he landed the front desk job, where hooligans wouldn't be as tempted to take the mickey out of him. The remainder consisted of WPC Justine Farewell, a tall, Teutonic blonde who worked hard, but who Lucy still had reservations about. What kind of policewoman seriously went on duty in lustrous silk stockings and spent hours beforehand with her makeup? And PC's Tony Maddock and Gary Grimes. The former was an experienced street man, burly and bullish, with big shoulders and a heavy black beard, the sort who'd try to boss every conversation, even with his gaffers, especially if they happened to be female. Grimes, on the other hand, was the baby of the relief, a 24-year-old probationer who still turned up for work with ridiculously short haircuts, gleaming boots, and razor creases in his pants. He was the one Lucy really worried about. To a man like John Stroud, he'd be easy meat. "It may sound like a cliché, but we're going to have to be extra vigilant tonight," she told them as they filed out of the parade room. "I'll keep running checks on all of you. Don't forget to test your radios properly before you go out. We're staying in constant touch." Justine took the area panda, Maddock the subdivisional van. Lucy herself checked out the supervision car. Grimes would be walking alone on the precinct area. It was by far the most vulnerable spot for break-ins, so a foot patrol was regarded as vital on nights. That was the loneliest beat of the lot, but it had to be covered. Before she went out, Lucy popped into the custody suite and had a quick word with Sergeant Claymore. He was over 50, vast of girth, and had a huge, shaggy beard. If his dishevelled appearance didn't immediately proclaim that he was counting down the hours to retirement, his attitude did. As always, he was agog with indifference. "So if we get any bodies in tonight, Joe, yourself and Jerry will have to make do," Lucy was saying. I want everyone else out and about." Claymore leaned on his hand and gazed at her over the charge office counter. His expression was sleepy with disinterest. He was another one who she knew had little time for women in the job, especially if they made sergeant. As she walked out of the station, Lucy had never felt so bereft of able-bodied support. She spent the next couple of hours cruising around the subdivision, however, closely eyeing the decayed structures of the flats and tenements. It was a bombed-out sprawl. She couldn't think of plainer terms to describe it in. A concrete jungle covered in litter and graffiti, which gave out here and there to vast areas of wasteland strewn with demolition rubble. Lucy was an East End girl herself, born and raised in Hackney. She'd never known things this bad, though, even when the slums had been teeming. Tough, yes, but never like this. An empty wilderness of tunnels, walkways, and trash-strewn courts. 11 o'clock came and went uneventfully, then past. Midnight arrived, however, and Lucy began to wonder at the silence on the air. Even Wednesday nights weren't normally this quiet. Eventually she called up Grimes and told him to meet her at the south end of the precinct. He was waiting there when she pulled up. She parked out of sight, then they walked slowly together between the endless ranks of metal-grilled shop fronts, their leather soles clicking on the cement footpaths. As always, Grimes was nervous in the presence of his section sergeant and answered her questions in broken monosyllables. She glanced up at him. He was a tall lad, well-built in a rangy sort of way, but he constantly had the look of a startled rabbit about him. He was starting to turn sallow in the cheek as well, and it was still only midnight. Lucy sighed inwardly. It took some people a long time to acclimatize to bobbying. It took certain people forever. An hour later, when she finally drove off again, she was far from happy about leaving Grimes alone. He'd walked the precinct dozens and dozens of times since he'd left the company of his tutor constable, but tonight she felt he was a sitting target. The entire subdivision seemed to be deserted, however, and after brief meetings with Maddock and Justine, Lucy returned to the Nick and went into the local intelligence office, where she dug out the files on John Stroud. They were extensive. A lean, weaselly face glared out at her from his most recent mugshot. His fair hair greased back in strands, his cheeks both criss-crossed with old razor cuts. His form seemed to go back into criminal history and was exclusively violent. And he was no respecter of sex either. What he'd once done to a prison psychiatrist who dared turn her back on him made Lucy shudder. She remembered the night they'd brought him into the station. She'd been a WPC at the time, helping out in the charge office. He'd come in quietly enough, inevitable with 10 armed plainclothes guys around him, but they said he'd already taken a few people out and would have to be watched like a hawk. He was tall, but also lean and very fit. His face was indescribably brutal, but she remembered them saying that his main asset was his cunning. He had hundreds of aliases, was a master of disguise, and a top-notch escaper. Talk about Category A. She replaced the files, turned the light off, and closed the door behind her. After all that, it was a relief to get back out on the streets. The night had dragged on, and a few odd jobs were dribbling in. Justine had been sent to a burglary on the far side of the subdivision, but Maddock was dealing with an intruder in the hospital grounds, which sounded ominous. Lucy got her foot down. The massive Gothic shape of the hospital was silent and sat in obsidian darkness. Lucy found the PC at the rear of it, strolling across one of the lawned areas, the van parked up close by. She picked him out from a distance by the strong beam of his torch. "I radioed for you, Sarge," he told her as she approached. "But CAD said you were off the air. Couldn't raise you." "Yeah, I was busy," she muttered. "Thought you wanted to keep in contact tonight." "Yes, I do, Tony, but as I say, I was busy. I was back in the Nick. Anyway, what have we got?" Maddox shrugged his big shoulders. Druggies, probably. No trace of damage or a break. Don't see what interest our Mr. Stroud would have here. She looked sharply at him. Just for a second she'd fancied there was some mockery in that voice. But the face under the flat hat was as grim and saturnine as always, more so in the half-darkness. "Well, let's not take any chances, eh?" she said, setting off back to the supervision car. "Keep in touch." Grimes and Maddox were due for their refreshments at 2, and she saw them both making their way into the station as she drove past. Justine was proving more elusive, however. Of the 3 constables, she was having the busier night of it. So far she'd taken 2 crime reports and dealt with a domestic. Lucy finally found her in the underpass. It was pitch black down there, and the Panda's headlights came out through the murk like 2 luminous eyes. The vehicles slowed down as they passed each other. Both women wound down their windows. "Morning, Sergeant," said Justine in that clipped, efficient tone of hers. Lucy nodded. "Anything?" Justine shook her head. "Quiet as the grave." "Love the terminology, Juss," said Lucy. "OK, on 3 o'clock refs. You'll be on your Todd, I'm afraid. The other 2 are inside now." The WPC shrugged. Lucy couldn't imagine the tall blonde finding the company of either Maddox or Grimes all that appealing at this hour of the morning anyway. "Keep your eyes open, love," she said, before pulling slowly away. She circled the subdivision for the next 2 hours or so, sticking close to the boundaries, occasionally passing the precinct, knowing how vulnerable it would be with the town centre man on his break. There was now a fresh autumn wind blowing, which smelled like rain. Ordinarily, bad weather was a godsend on nights. It tended to keep the scum indoors. On this occasion, however, she was cursing it. If only it was the middle of June instead of the back end of October. Dawn would be breaking just about now, throwing lovely bright sunlight over everything, instead of total, all-enveloping darkness like this. She was halfway up Galloway Hill when she fancied she saw a figure standing at the top of a flight of steps. She braked abruptly and reversed down the empty street. When she reached the steps, however, there was nobody on them. They were hemmed in on both sides by dense bushes and ran up to another sprawling council estate. Lucy sighed. She knew that she had no option but to walk up and have a look. If it wasn't Stroud, it could be someone dogging out for a burglary. She'd better at least check. She parked, collected her torch and radio, and went stealthily up. At the top there was flat ground and row after row of concrete maisonettes. Many were boarded up, the paved areas around them strewn with litter and broken glass. Right in front of her, though, she found what she'd taken to be the figure. An iron pillar was all that remained of a railing which had once run down the middle of the steps. Several rags had caught round it and were now billowing out. Lucy stood there for a moment, looking at it. Above her head, clouds were scudding across the moon. The wind was sighing through the barren canyons of the flats. For the first time that night, she began to wonder if she was going about any of this the right way. She turned and looked out over the subdivision. What on earth reason would John Stroud have to be sneaking around this desolate place? If she was him, what would she be doing at this particular moment? Logic insisted that by now she'd be as far from London as was humanly possible. But logic rarely came into it with maniacs like Stroud. Assuming he really was out there hoping to get some copper, what exactly would he be doing right now? She considered his attributes. He was vicious, clever, resourceful. He was also a professional. He rarely left things to chance. In which case he would hardly be prowling the benighted streets like some brain-dead urban Apache taking pot luck. He'd have an agenda, a plan. And if she was John Stroud, that plan would centre around the place where his targets least expected trouble, where they were most relaxed and therefore most vulnerable. Unable to seriously believe what she was now thinking, Lucy turned her gaze southwards, in the direction of the police station. She drove back there in double-quick time and consulted her watch as she pulled into the yard. It was just past 4, the quietest part of the night. Grimes and Maddock would have been back out on patrol for an hour. Justine would be on the verge of finishing her refs. Lucy might just be able to catch her. They'd search the Nick together. There'd be no need to even disturb Claymore and Taylor down in custody. She made her way in through the personnel door, and almost immediately it struck her what a rabbit warren the average police station could be, especially when deserted and standing in darkness like this. There were only 3 floors in this particular building, yet each one was a maze of rooms and passages, all now filled with shadows, or lit faintly in dim spectral stripes, street lighting filtering in through the Venetian blinds. In this immediate area alone, there'd be lavatories and a locker room to search, the CID office and admin department, the DI and DCI's personnel offices, the stationery and photocopy room, street thefts, the area suite, a locker room, lavatories and showers. Doors seemed to open off on all sides of her, each leading into blackness. There was a stony silence. Lucy shook her head. She was overreacting badly. Surely Stroud couldn't have got into the building, even if he'd wanted to. The only access was by 2 doors, the personnel door at the side, which required a key code known only to staff, and the front door, which had an electronic lock on it and could only be opened if the front desk buzzed it open. There were plenty of windows, of course, but they were all securely alarmed. Then again, John Stroud wasn't the sort of man to balk at alarms or secret key codes. He'd got round both in the past, with ease. She made her way quickly along the ground-floor corridor and paused beside the door to the front desk. There was no sound, either from in there or the custody suite on the other side of it. In the absence of prisoners or customers, Claymore and Taylor were probably taking the opportunity to have a doze. Well, that was fine. It would keep them out of her hair. Lucy strolled past and went up the stairs to the first floor. She turned at the top and walked down the corridor towards the canteen. The door was open at the far end, and she could see the distant shape of Justine standing by the microwave table, pulling on her tunic. Lucy was about to hail her when 3 things suddenly hit her all at once. The door to the television room was open. The light was turned off inside. A man was sitting in one of the armchairs, very still. Lucy froze in her stride. Immediately she flattened herself against the wall. She had only glanced into the room as she'd passed, but even in the darkness she'd distinctly seen the outline of a figure in the facing armchair. Suddenly her heart was going 10 to the dozen. "Justine!" she hissed sharply. In the corner of her eye she saw the WPC look round in the canteen. "In here!" the sergeant whispered, motioning at the television room. Her gaze was locked on the open doorway and the darkness flowing out of it. She sensed rather than saw Justine come quickly down the corridor towards her. Lucy waited a second, then sprang. She had no truncheon, but she did have a heavy-duty torch which she'd used as a weapon on more than one occasion, and holding it over her right shoulder she dashed into the small room, stabbing out with her left hand and turning the light on. And for a split second she couldn't take in what she was seeing. There was a figure in the armchair, but it was Gary Grimes, and he appeared to be fast asleep, his head lolling on his shoulder. Tony Maddock was also in there in another armchair, and he also was sleeping. And what about Sergeant Claymore and Jerry Taylor? They were on the opposite side. Their heads were lolling too. Lucy hardly knew what she was seeing. She felt Justine come up behind her and heard a sharp intake of breath. Almost without realizing what she was doing, knowing that she was on the verge of shrieking, the sergeant reached out blindly for the WPC's hand. She took it, but it felt cold and flabby and limp. Lucy looked slowly down. She had taken Justine's hand all right, Only Justine was slumped in the armchair beside the door, naked. Lucy never had a chance to cry out. The silk stocking round her neck put paid to that.
The Australian by Andrew Puckett. Read by Anton Rogers.
Rain. The hypnotic beat of the wipers. I never pick up hitches as a rule, but this one gave me no choice. He turned when he heard me and stood in the middle of the narrow tree-lined road, his arms outstretched. I pulled up and buzzed down the window of the borrowed BMW a couple of inches. "Sorry to be so pushy," he said, leaning an elbow on the car roof to speak through the gap. "But me car's broken down. Maybe you noticed it, a jag, a mile or so back." Nasal Australian accent, dripping hair. "No, I didn't." Well, I surely appreciate a lift to the nearest garage. Not much traffic along this road." "No, that's why I'd taken it." Perhaps I should have driven off at that stage, but I'd already hesitated too long. "All right, you'd better get in." I pulled on driving gloves as he moved around the bonnet, his feet slipping slightly on the wet leaves that had fallen from the trees. He opened the door and climbed in. I reached out to turn the radio off and then thought, why the hell should I? I like classic FM better than I like Australians. "Thanks," he said. "I really appreciate this." He was gangly, about 6 feet, with close-set brown eyes and a long face. He smiled, showing prominent teeth. "That's all right," I said, as I let in the clutch. It wasn't all right. He was drenched, dripping water everywhere. Charles will be pleased, I thought wryly, as it soaked into the seat and carpets. He pulled out a handkerchief, mopped his face. "Where's the nearest garage, do you know?" "Not offhand. Probably not until we get to Downfield, the next town." "How far's that?" he demanded. "Oh, 8 or 10 miles. "Sorry if I'm putting you out." He didn't sound sorry at all. "That's all right." The water was evaporating from his clothes, fogging up the windows. I switched on the demisters. "You see, I have to get to Dover today sometime. It's important." "Really?" Dover was where I was going, to catch a ferry for the continent, but I wasn't going to tell him that. I don't like Australians much anyway, but something about this one really set my teeth on edge. ESP, perhaps. "Yeah," he continued. "If the garage can't fix it, maybe they'll hire me a car. They have cars for hire there, don't you, do you know?" "No, I'm afraid I don't." I changed down for a sharp bend. "You see, it's really important that I get to Dover today." "Well, you can always catch a train from Downfield." "Is the station near the garage?" "Yes." I had no idea, but I'd already done him enough favours. There was a short silence. Not a silence at all, really. The beat of the wipers, the hum of the demisters, the slick noise of the tyres on the road and wet leaves. The opening bars of Beethoven's Fifth on the radio. I turned it up slightly, hoping it would prevent him talking any more. "Never realised there were places like this in England," he said. "I mean, so close to London. Kind of got the idea that all England was like London, you know?" I didn't say anything. His voice was becoming like a bow saw across the strings of my nerves. "Course, in ours, we got thousands of miles of it. Space, I mean," he chuckled. "Not with this kind of weather, though." "No." I reached forward and turned the radio up again. "You like this piece of music?" "That's right." "Seem to have heard it before myself. What is it?" "Beethoven's Fifth." "Fifth what?" He couldn't be that thick. He had to be putting it on for some reason. "Symphony." "Oh, yeah, great." He started ta-ta-tumming along with it. Even that was preferable to his talking. I tried to close my mind to him and concentrate on driving faster, the more quickly to be rid of him. I glanced at the clock. Should make Dover in time for the midday ferry. France in 2 hours. Spain in what, another 10? The car skidded sideways on some mud. I twisted the wheel to regain control. Steady on, sport. Let's get there in one piece, eh? Like me to drive for a spell? No, thank you, I said with difficulty. Not far to Downfield now. I could feel him looking at me speculatively. I swallowed, clenched the wheel. With a crescendo of French horns, the movement reached its finale as I sighted Downfield below us, sighed with relief. What a lovely piece of music. Now don't go away, because we've got the second movement coming up just after a couple of minutes. Advertisement for a skin cream.
All we girls want is lots of lovely moisture.
Ah, bloody hell, I thought, hysterically, as the rain splattered against the windscreen. News headlines. The body of Mrs. Deirdre Sheffield, the Australian heiress, has been discovered in her home in Finchley. I tingled, as though I'd been touched with a live wire. The police are anxious to trace her husband, Mr. Paul Sheffield, who is thought to be driving a Jaguar XJS and may be trying to reach Harwich, where he has a boat. I didn't dare look at him. The police say that Mr. Sheffield, who is described as being 5'11", with brown eyes and hair, and whose little finger on his right hand is missing, should not be approached under him. Couldn't help it. Glanced across at him. Made eye contact. Saw that he knew that I knew. I had to kill him. He'd seen my hand. Besides, I can't stand Australians.
The Butcher's Dozen by Robert Eastland. Read by Peter Barkworth.
The front page headline that morning was a shocker. Number 11, it screamed. The stark black and white photograph beneath it showed leaning gravestones wreathed in ivy. And Miss Mercer fished her spectacles out of her dressing-gown pocket in order to read the accompanying story. A police spokesman last night announced that fragments of a human corpse found yesterday in Highgate Cemetery are now believed to belong to yet another victim of the psychopath known as the Mad Butcher of Enfield. If so, this will be the 11th murder attributed to the killer in the past 2 years. Good heavens, she muttered. The Mad Butcher of Enfield? Whatever will they come up with next? She tucked the newspaper under her arm and shuffled through into the kitchen to make herself some tea and toast. As she did so, a loud rapping sounded on the front door. Miss Mercer looked round in surprise and glanced at the kitchen clock. It was only 8:15. The morning post had already been delivered, and the milkman normally came at around 5. Outside, the murderer waited patiently on the front doorstep. A tatty brown briefcase sat beside him, and he stood rigid in the sickly chill of the dawn, his large, knotted hands deep in the pockets of his shabby raincoat. He was a short, solid block of a man, with a pitted, swarthy complexion and thick, horn-rimmed glasses. He wore his hair very short, severely so, and hanging in strings over his heavy bone brow. His eyes were bloodshot, his broad face sallow from lack of sleep. It wasn't too bad a place, he decided, as he looked around him. To one side of the weedy drive, the garden was unkempt with a straggling lawn and derelict garage beyond it. The house itself leaned out over him, the gables above looking ready to slide off altogether, the walls cracked and filled with lichen. It wasn't too bad a place. It would suit his purposes, anyway. He knocked on the front door again. A moment passed, then a latch turned on the other side, and the murderer heard somebody fumbling with a safety chain. Somebody old and arthritic, he decided at once, pleased. Only the stiff and twisted fingers of the old and arthritic fumbled like that. The door opened slightly, and a white-faced old lady looked curiously out. "Yes?" she inquired. "Miss Mercer?" he asked, in a resonant, educated voice. "I believe you have a room to let." Miss Mercer seemed lost for words and eyed him up and down. He gave her a warm, friendly smile. It's a bit early," she finally said. "Fred Saunders," he announced, still beaming. He held out a hand of welcome. "Dr. Frederick Saunders." Oh, doctor." The murderer saw her relax a little. "Oh, well, why didn't you say so?" she said, unfastening the chain. "Come in, do." The murderer stepped inside and wiped his feet on the thick brush mat. He looked around at the sparsely furnished hall, with its solemn paintings and wormy wooden panels. The kitchen was visible through an open door at one end, a bleak, cold place of whitewashed stone by the looks of it. More scullery than a kitchen. Some of these old dears preferred them like that, he considered. It reminded them of a joyous, sunlit childhood, which existed only in their tired, worn-out imaginations. Ornaments of what looked like African origin, carved hunters, spearheads and grass dolls, occupied a low sideboard to his right, while to the left of the kitchen door a steep staircase rose up into darkness. The entire structure reeked of dry rot. Still, the place was clean and serviceable enough. Eventually he looked back at her. Only then, when close up to him, did she notice the odd fish-like gleam in the eyes behind the thick pebble glasses. "I trust this early call is not too great an inconvenience," he said. "Only I detected rain in the air, and I didn't want to wait around too long outside for fear that I might get a soaking." "Oh," was all she could say. Miss Mercer was a little disconcerted at the thought of a man waiting around outside her house in the early morning for any length of time. You've been looking around the neighbourhood, then?" "Not really," he replied. "I've heard about your vacancy from a friend, and I came straight here as soon as my train pulled in. Do forgive me for rousing you at this early hour." "Oh, it's no trouble," she finally said, collecting a key from a vase on the telephone table. She unlocked a door across the hall. It's a downstairs flat, but I think you'll find it quite spacious." The murderer followed her in and found himself in a wide, low-ceilinged room with a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a table, and a chimney breast which had long been bricked up and painted over. A small wash-basin stood in one corner with a portable stove packed away beneath it, its cable wrapped around it and coated in the dust of long disuse. The room looked exceedingly bare, even to the murderer's Spartan eye. The ceiling had grime in the corners, and the bed smelled damp. A radiator ran under the large bay window, but was icy cold. "Charming," he declared. "Absolutely charming. And how much shall I be required to pay?" "Well," said Miss Mercer, now beginning to wonder why a doctor should dress so shabbily and leave his fingernails so encrusted with dirt. "It's £40 a week, pay in advance." "Aha," he grunted, dumping down his case and burrowing into an inside pocket. "Very reasonable, I must say." He produced a wad of £5 notes from a blue leather purse, which looked as though it should belong to a woman, and handed them to her without even bothering to make a count. "I take it I can have access to the bathroom and lavatory?" "Well, yes, but, He looked slowly round at her, an eerie gleam in his eyes. "But, Miss Mercer?" She recoiled from him. "But, she continued, stuttering, "I'd prefer it if you didn't run a bath after 10:30 at night, as I tend to go to bed early." "Of course," he said, suddenly amiable again, his massive features splitting into a toothy grin. He began to peel off his greasy overcoat. "Do you require milk or newspapers, Dr. Saunders, anything like that?" she asked, eyeing the worn elbows of his shirt with some distaste, not to mention the frayed cuffs and the black-green stains under his collar. "I prefer to do my own shopping, thank you," he said, no longer looking at her. "Do you require a rent book, then, or anything?" "No, thank you, Miss Mercer," he said loudly, rubbing his big calloused hands together. "Well, very well, then, I'll leave you be," she finally muttered, withdrawing from the room. A few minutes later, Miss Mercer had decided that she didn't like the way that interview had gone. As she made herself a fresh cup of tea, and then, armed with her newspaper, climbed slowly up the stairs to settle down again under the quilt, she went over the events of that morning. Dr. Saunders was a very strange man, she finally concluded. 5 minutes later, she decided that she didn't like him. 10 minutes later, she decided that he wasn't a doctor either, at least not a proper one. Only then did it begin to occur to her that she didn't really know who he was, and that she'd already let him in and make himself at home. Not that she was unduly frightened by that. Miss Mercer had been letting rooms since her father's death in Kenya in 1955, and her sad and lonely return to their ancestral home here in England. So she had plenty of experience of lodgers. She didn't usually even bother with references. The price of the room was often enough to put the more unpleasant kind of homeless people off. And anyway, if there was any trouble, she had a good, strong lock on her bedroom, and had a separate telephone up there. She'd never had any call to use either, and she doubted she would on this occasion, though she did feel a little more uncomfortable than usual. Miss Mercer didn't see Dr. Saunders for some time after that. She put in her teeth, then washed, dressed, tied back the curtains in every room, and put out some crumbs for the birds on the back lawn, as was her custom, before tying on her pinny and cheerfully commencing her daily routine. By mid-morning she was busying herself around the hall and porch, feather dusting. Later on, in the afternoon, she put on a shawl, collected her basket, and set off on the weekly trek down to the mini-market. She wondered briefly if it was worth checking with Dr. Saunders to see if he required anything, but there was no sound from his room. He remained hidden from view for all that evening as well, until about 9 o'clock, when Miss Mercer had changed into her nightgown and bedrobe again and was just descending the stairs to find him blocking her passage. He was in his shirt sleeves and had apparently combed and greased back his hair. Aside from that, he'd attended to his person but little, and a stale odour of sweat hung about him. "Good evening, Miss Mercer," he said. "I trust the day has been well with you?" She nodded and hung back a little. He may have been short and squat, but he was of huge breadth. His shoulders literally filled the stairwell from wall to banister. "I should be grateful if you'd allow me to use your telephone," he said. Miss Mercer was momentarily lost for words. "Well, I usually charge 10 pence per call," she finally stammered, "for use of the telephone in the hall. If you just put your money in the plate on the table." "Of course," he said. And a second later he'd gone, moving with surprising agility back down the steep stairs and into his room. The door closed quietly behind him, and then she heard the key turning in the lock. It was late that night before Dr. Saunders actually did use the phone. Miss Mercer was just snuggling down between her goose-feather pillows and piping hot water bottles when she heard a distinctive jingle down in the hallway. She climbed painfully from her bed, trying not to creak it too loudly on the old floorboards, then put on her carpet slippers and shuffled out onto the darkened landing. At the bottom of the stairs, clearly visible in the light shining out from his room, Dr. Saunders was in conversation with someone on the telephone. Miss Mercer watched him suspiciously. He was fully dressed. In fact, he had his raincoat on again. That was surely unusual at 11 o'clock at night. Dr. Saunders had a loud bass voice, and even talking quietly as he was attempting to do now, she could still hear him. It was just a matter of adjusting her earpiece. "Don't give me that, you bloody little pipsqueak. Now listen to me. Just you listen to me. The place is crawling with pigs. I'm staying exactly where I am for the time being. Now, you'd better have that money, you bastard, or I'll gut you like a fish when I get back." Oh, yes, really. Well, just have what you owe me, all right? I don't care how you get it, just get it. And with that, he slammed down the phone, then closed and locked the door to his room, and, drawing up his collar around his face, furtively left the house by the front door. No, Miss Mercer decided. Dr. Saunders was definitely not a very nice man. The following morning she was disturbed by another early caller, though this was perhaps a more welcome one. She opened the front door to find Constable Gideon standing there. He was a large, portly officer with a thick chestnut moustache and apple-red cheeks. The sky was clear if cold that morning, so he wore no cape or anorak over his neat black uniform, but was standing on the step with a clipboard under one arm and a pen in his hand. "Ah, Miss Mercer," he said in his usual hearty manner. "Good morning to you, ma'am. I'm sorry it's a wee bit early, but we're going to have to visit all the houses in the district today." "Oh," she said, a little surprised. Is something wrong?" His expression darkened a little. "I'm afraid there is, yes, and it's a very grim business it is, too. You know there's been a series of murders in the area recently." She considered hard. "I think I do," she eventually said. "Haven't they been writing about them in the newspapers?" He nodded. "They have indeed, and believe me, they haven't been exaggerating. It's a very nasty affair, very nasty indeed." She shivered, and he immediately put a consoling arm about her shoulders. "Not to worry, though, ma'am. I'm sure we'll catch him. Now, the thing is, you see, we're doing what's called a house-to-house. All that means is that I've got to ask you a lot of quick questions, all right?" "Well, yes, if you think it'll help, Constable." "Oh, I'm sure it will," he said, grinning, and lifting up his clipboard and pen. "Now, have you seen anyone in the area at all you didn't like the look of, who's a stranger, perhaps, or is someone who's been behaving rather peculiarly?" She shook her face dumbly. Right, that's okay. Now, has any of your neighbours changed their routine, perhaps? Does anyone go out at night instead of at day? Has anyone new moved into the area?" And so it went on for another 10 minutes. When Constable Gideon had left, deeply regretting that he didn't have time for a cuppa, Miss Mercer withdrew into her house to think. Glancing sideways, she saw the door to Dr. Saunders' room ajar by a tiny fraction, and the cold, glazed eye of the gentleman himself looking out at her in a most piercing manner. A moment later, the door clicked shut, and the key turned in the lock. She was beginning to get her suspicions about Dr. Saunders, very firm suspicions indeed, she decided. Perhaps it was time to do something. And off she went to prepare. An hour later, she reappeared beside his door, swathed in her shawl, and knocked loudly. Initially, there was no reply, so she knocked again. Eventually he appeared, still clad in his usual crumpled clothes, only now looking sleepy and unshaven. She backed away from him a little, but now feeling organised and reminding herself that she was the mistress of this house, stayed resolute. Dr. Saunders, I really must complain about this behaviour. He feigned innocence, though his feigning was clearly only skin deep. My dear Miss Mercer, what behaviour? You are a naughty man, you know, to keep me awake at night the way you did. His red-rimmed eyes seemed to narrow. I kept you awake last night? Why, yes, on the telephone, really. 11 o'clock is not the time to be making phone calls, and I object most strongly to the language you used. What must your friend think of you speaking to him like that? Was that the friend who directed you to this house? I sincerely hope not, for all the people I know would be deeply offended to be spoken to like that. He leaned against the doorframe and folded his large arms. I feel there's something I should tell you, Miss Mercer. No friend directed me to this house. I got your name and address from the local parish magazine, which I picked up for 5 pence from a newsagent. He smiled, but now there was no warmth in it. Yes, Miss Mercer, nobody knows I'm here at all. Nervously, she took a step away from him towards the kitchen. Perhaps you'd care for a spot of tea? There's no time for tea now, Miss Mercer, he said, slowly straightening up again. You really shouldn't eavesdrop on private conversations. You really shouldn't, you know. Miss Mercer turned quickly, and as fast as she was able, made her way along the hall and veered right into the kitchen. The murderer followed at a leisurely pace, stopping only to rip out the telephone cable. In the kitchen, he could hear her fumbling with the latch on the back door. Ah, those old arthritic fingers, he thought. What a nuisance they could be. When he entered the kitchen, she was just in the act of passing out through the back door, and he watched her through the window over the sink as she tottered across the lawn towards the garage, her wrinkled face chalk white and straining with the effort. The murderer grinned, then selected a razor-sharp fruit knife from the drawer before following her. When he went outside, however, he was surprised to see her disappearing into the garage, rather than rounding the corner of the house in the direction of the front drive. That brought an element of uncertainty into the affair, and elements of uncertainty he didn't need. He strode quickly towards the garage. The knife was concealed up his sleeve, in case any neighbour was watching through the tall trees surrounding the property. Inside the garage, it was dark, damp, and reeked of brick mould. But the murderer was surprised to find a Mini Cooper parked there. It had a very old registration mark, but was in good condition and quite clean, with firm runnels gouged into the soft earth floor behind its tyres. So it had obviously been driven recently. It was now standing in the shadows, the pale light from outside gleaming in its chrome bumper bar. Momentarily, the murderer was flummoxed. This didn't mean she had another lodger, did it? The car is mine, Dr. Saunders, she suddenly announced, stepping out from the darkness at the far end of the chamber. And the police will know it and instantly recognise it. So don't think you can steal it. I wouldn't dream of stealing it, dear lady, he replied, ambling stealthily along the left-hand side of the car towards her. To begin with, I've no driving licence. Fearlessly, Miss Mercer remained where she was, her slight pointed chin held proudly out, her seamed face in a stern frown of disapproval. I don't think I want you in my house much longer, she said. I've some rather unpleasant suspicions about you, Dr. Saunders. 'Tis a terrible thing, is suspicion, he said, coming closer, the fruit knife hidden behind his back. He had now reached the front off-side of the parked car and moved around it, stepping over some crates, fixing her with his spear-like gaze. Trembling, she stood her ground as best she could. She was a game old bird, he reflected. Either that or she was possibly too senile to realize the peril she was in. Normally, they at least showed some fear by now, some dull-witted animal understanding that their worthless life was at an end. He would show her the knife, he decided. That always brought a reaction, when you showed them the implement of their destruction. Then she shot him. It was very dark in the dilapidated garage, and the murderer's sight had never been that good at the best of times, so he could not possibly have seen the old Webley revolver buried in the folds of her shawl. He fell stiffly, gaping, and hit the hard ground a lifeless husk, the knife still tightly clasped in his gnarled fist. Miss Mercer came tentatively forward to check that he was dead. He was, and she was hardly surprised. Her father's old gun had never once misfired, and from this close range even she couldn't possibly have missed. For a moment she stood thinking in the darkness. Now, what to do? He'd already told her that nobody knew he was there. Well, that was a good start, she supposed. It was just a pity that he wasn't lying closer to the back of the car. This was not going to be easy, she thought resignedly, as she shuffled around to the boot, then unlocked it and took out the hacksaw and cleaver. It was always easy to make a body more disposable. She'd watched the Mau Mau terrorists do that with countless of their hostages during her long, long captivity in Kenya. Her poor father only one of them. But this time she would have to be far more careful where she sprinkled the pieces. She'd been surprised, rather than alarmed, at the speed with which the police had connected her 11 other victims. But there was no point in taking unnecessary chances. The Mau Mau had been very careless. And look what happened to them.
Method of Madness by Paul Lewis. Read by Ross Kemp.
The bar was Saturday night noisy. Babbles of voices, jukebox gone insane, shrieking a metal fan's tasteless selection. Stale smells, sweat, cigarettes, beer, all ganged up to assault me as I pushed my way through the crowd to the bar. Some spotty kid couldn't have been much older than 19, turned away from the counter carrying 2 beers. He caught my shoulder with his jutting left elbow as he went past. "Sorry, pal," he muttered, not looking up. I grunted a friendly, "That's okay," in response and scanned the line of bar stools. She was there, waiting for me, just as we'd arranged. 30 or so, blonde, slim, not too much makeup, just enough to hide the faint wrinkling around her baby blues. She had a drink already. It looked like orange. I hoped that was a vodka and orange. I wanted her relaxed, at ease with me. She smiled as I walked towards her. "Hi," she said. "Hi. Sorry I'm late, couldn't get a cab." No, that's okay. I was early." And it went on. Dialogue so bad it would disgrace a B-movie. I sat with her at the bar for maybe an hour, not much longer, biding my time. Timing was always important. Then, when the noise got about as loud as it could conceivably get, the crowd as claustrophobic as possible, I suggested somewhere else. She jumped at the chance. Winter was grudgingly giving way to spring. Although the evenings had started to lengthen, there was no daylight left now. Orange street lamps tried to punch holes in the night without much success. I held her hand after a few tentative, almost accidental brushes as we walked. Nearly 10 o'clock, and dark. But a warmish breeze had sprung up from somewhere, and the night was unseasonably pleasant. And quiet. Perfectly quiet. This was how I liked it. We strolled and chatted, me laughing easily whenever she said something I knew which she meant to be witty. "So, what do you do? For a living, I mean," she said. "I'm a writer, well, a journalist," I added, in a tone suggesting I found my occupation a cause for embarrassment. "Really? I've never dated a reporter before." "Well, there's a first time for everything," I said. We walked through the main part of the town and out the other side, leaving the shops and bars and nightclubs behind, heading for the river, Where are we going? Well, I thought you might fancy a walk along the riverbank. I'm cold, she said. Her whining voice was beginning to grate on me, but somehow I managed to smile. You won't feel cold in a moment, I said, and she laughed. The river was eerie by moonlight, black flecked with silver. It'd sound a constant burst of white noise in the darkness. The wide path alongside was separated from the water by bushes. We walked a little way along it, and then stopped and embraced. I pressed my lips against hers, felt her body push against mine. One hand reached out to the back of her neck, caressing. The other eased into my jacket pocket to grip the knife. I'd spent most of the afternoon sharpening the thing, and knew it would have my fingers off if I wasn't, oh, so careful taking it out. Both my arms around her waist now. I pulled her close and unwrapped the square of cloth behind her back. When the blade was revealed, and I twisted away from her, my arm rising then falling, a flash of light, a reflection of moonlight, her sudden cry seemed piercingly loud in the darkness. The next morning, I went out and bought a copy of every paper the newsagents had on its shelf. The locals made a real splash of the murder, of course, but it had also merited a front-page mention in the Express, although most of the story was continued on page 2. Even the Times thought it warranted a column on page 3. Tracy, a 31-year-old secretary, was found dead at the edge of the river by 2 dawn fishermen. She had been stabbed repeatedly. She was seen in the city centre bar the previous night with a man police now want to trace. He is described as... The description didn't matter. From the moment I'd arrived home last night, it was out of date. I looked a different man once the hair dye was washed away and the moustache was gently tugged off. Changing out of that ridiculously old-fashioned suit into my usual denims completed the transformation. The suit would have to go, of course, because of the blood. Dead giveaway, so to speak. It would join the other junk I would burn in a backyard bonfire later. I dropped the newspaper and leaned back in my chair, silently listing the lessons that were to be learnt. It had all gone smoothly enough. Maybe I'd pushed my luck a little with the busy bar, but I was virtually certain nobody was going to recognise me. I could picture the scene in my mind. The detective is mid-40s, beer-bellied, angry because this has happened in his town. There was a kid no more than 19 who remembers seeing Tracy in the bar that night. Who was she with, the detective asks, trying to be gentle with the spotted little nobody, remembering that after all he isn't the one who stuck the knife in. A man, responds the kid nervously, about 6 foot, brown hair, glasses, had a sort of old-fashioned suit on, you know, like something from the 70s, big lapels and stuff. You seen him anywhere before? The kid frowns, shaking his head. Don't think so. No, I'm sure I haven't. He shakes his head again, as if to give his words extra emphasis. And even if there is the smallest niggling doubt in the back of his mind, it'll go away before too long. No, I had no worries on that score. What I was less than happy with was the persona I'd adopted for that night. Mike Bradford, journalist, an occupation inspired by the media coverage of the previous murders. It had seemed a nicely ironic touch at the time, but now I had second thoughts. Nothing I could put my finger on. It was just something I felt truly uncomfortable with, in the same way that I'd not felt at ease with Robert Collins or Kevin Johnson or any of the other temporary lives I'd created while I went about my work. For the next one, I became Peter Lloyd. I not only had him sussed, I also liked him an awful lot. He could be the one, I thought. Lloyd was a quietly confident man, a teacher who wrote short stories in his spare time. The writing was a sort of secret, something he had only told a few close friends about, such as the girl I was with tonight. She was pretty in an old-fashioned, almost prudish sort of way. She wore no makeup, had her hair in a ponytail, bore scars to remind her of her teenage acne. Her clothes were more suited to a woman 10 years older. She was waiting for me outside the cinema. She had told me when we'd met at a party I'd gate-crashed that she didn't like bars. We walked out of the theatre into the rainy night. I turned my collar up, shivering, and searched the streets for a taxi. She enjoyed the film, Woody Allen's latest, although he'd only directed in it, not starred, and after a little gentle persuasion, had agreed to the suggestion of dinner at a good Chinese restaurant I knew. 2 hours later, it was looking very promising. I had talked until I thought my throat would go raw. She was hardly the world's greatest conversationalist, but As my pleasant chatter continued, she gradually contributed more to the dialogue. Then she had agreed to a glass of wine to accompany the pungent chicken dish she had chosen as her main course. That glass had led to a second. A third was not far behind, and after that she opened up considerably. Not as much, however, as she would open up later. Nearly midnight, the restaurant was quiet. The post-pub crowd had left for home. The disco crowd was a good 2 hours away. She was laughing like a kid. Not that she'd drunk a lot of wine. She just wasn't used to that amount she'd put away. I was very happy about this. It would make my work a lot easier. I called over the waiter, the type of Chinese who gave all the customers the same sneering look, ordered 2 final glasses of wine, and then went to the public phone and booked a cab. Sitting in the car so close to the driver who might later remember me was not the brightest of ideas, of course, but I was in a mood for taking risks. Besides, what would the driver remember? A blonde guy with dark eyes, trendy suit, Italian or something, snakeskin loafers, spoke with a hint of a stutter and some kind of an accent. Tip well. This will be fine, I told the driver. The girl blinked. I don't live here. Don't worry, I smiled. You'll like this. We got out, me reaching into the driver's open window and handing him a note. Keep it. The driver gave his first grin of the night. Thanks, friend. I watched the car pull away, then took the girl's arm and began leading her towards the park I'd spotted on my afternoon reconnaissance. I whistled cheerfully snatches of old songs, improvised melodies, anything that came to mind. The girl was obviously nervous. Where are we going? Just wait and see, I told her. There's this place not many people know about. Believe me, you'll love it. Promise? I promised. So we entered the park and I took out the knife and began to show her the place. But I had to break my promise. She didn't love it at all. From the way Detective Carl Cameron glared at me, I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He had tracked down the killer and there was no way I was going to slip off the hook. I relished the challenge. Cameron was in his mid-40s, a beer-bellied man who looked as if he'd spent his life in a perpetual bad mood. He sucked deeply on a battered Marlboro and stood behind me. Now, he said, measuring his words carefully, are you going to talk or am I going to have to stop being so nice? Go screw yourself, I replied cheerfully. Oh, and while you're at it, get hold of a new cop cliché book. Yours is out of date. Cameron nodded. I suppose he had not expected an easy time of it. From the moment they had pulled me in, I'd refused to give my name. My prints did not show up on the file, and, just to put them off guard, I had refused a lawyer. Perhaps he'd expected me to confess or at least cooperate, but all I had done was act the smartass. We know you did it, Cameron tried. Just a matter of time to get the evidence together, plenty of witnesses to put you at the scene of at least 3 of the killings. I'd say you were in deep, deep trouble. I began scraping dirt from beneath my fingernails, using the left thumb to clean the right hand and vice versa. It was a calm, studied action designed to get on Cameron's nerves. It worked. Cut that out, he snapped. You'd make life a lot easier for both of us if you started talking. I leaned back in my chair and sighed. Okay, I said. Okay. Cameron pushed the tape recorder's play button. My parents never loved me. Cameron shut the recorder off. Think you're funny, right? Right, I said, nodding solemnly. I glanced casually around the interview room. Wasn't much to look at, really, just walls, a door locked from the outside, and a mirror. I blew a kiss at the mirror for the benefit of those behind it. This place, I said thoughtfully, could do with a lick of paint. Cameron swore. He walked to the door and pounded on it. Open her up. He turned and faced me. Better start thinking this one over. I'll be back with a friend, and he ain't half as pleasant as me. Great, I grinned. I'll get the coffee on. Later, the questions started again, only this time for real. I don't like being interviewed. As far as I'm concerned, I do what I do, and my work speaks for itself. But compromises sometimes have to be made. The studio PR girl had made that clear. So I sat in my trailer sipping mineral water, waiting for the next take, a complex multi-camera scene. A young kid in jeans and a dire straight t-shirt was hovering around me with a Nikon, firing off shots from this angle and that. I tried to ignore him, concentrating instead on the more dignified movie universe writer who took notes the old-fashioned way with pen and pad. Mr. Shaw. Tony, please. Smile. Tony, your character in the film Peter Lloyd is a pure psychopath. It's your first major role, so how did you prepare for it? I didn't, I said. Just got my own idea of how a psycho would behave and went with it. Sure, Peter Lloyd started off as a character in the script, but I knew I could bring him to life. The writer scribbled frantically, delighted with the responses. He had watched the police interrogation scene we'd just filmed, and I guess he'd found it powerful stuff. I was going to be big news, and here he was, the only reporter allowed a face-to-face with the star. You obviously don't believe in the method school of acting, then? I laughed. I've got my methods all right, but I don't think Streep or Hoffman would be too impressed. The writer's tone became more serious. There's some controversy surrounding the film, even while it shoots. Yeah, those murders, I responded quietly. Terrible, terrible. But suggesting they've got anything to do with this film is ridiculous, honestly. There are guys out there who don't need any inspiration from the movies to do atrocious things, but it's just the way they are. Now the writer relaxed again. Tricky question out of the way. So, what's next for you after this, he asked, his allotted time almost up. Fancy being a hero? Maybe, I said. But maybe not. I like playing the bad guy. It's a lot of fun. Besides, I added, knowing it would make a good quote. There's a little bit of a psychopath in all of us, right?
The Truth About Agnes by Judy Gardner, read by Andrew Sachs.
The world seemed very quiet when she got off the bus and stood still for a moment, trying to pierce the darkness that rose up on all sides. I wish there were street lamps, she thought, watching the bus lights until they'd become extinguished by a bend in the road. Then her eyes adjusted themselves, and in the cool starlight she could make out the shapes of hedges and gates, and down the side of the lane the black mass of sleeping woodland. Darkness and isolation might be something of a disadvantage, but a country cottage lent by a kind friend was ideal in every other respect for the final stage of recuperation from a serious illness. Already the soft air, the scent of trees and bracken, and the song of the birds had made her feel a different person, stronger, happier, and calmer. With every quiet day, the memories of pain and fearfulness were steadily receding. Crossing the road, she turned down the lane where small night creatures rustled in the dry verges, and the dense trees seemed to be watching her. There was no wind. She walked briskly, thinking with pleasure of the film she'd seen, and she was less than half a mile from the cottage when a man suddenly stepped out from the trees and said, "Excuse me, can you tell me the right time?" Startled, she caught her breath. I'm sorry, I haven't got my watch," she said after a momentary hesitation. "But in any case, I think it'd be too dark to see it." "Yes, I suppose you're right," the man said, and remained standing on the side of the path just in front of her. He appeared a little less than medium height, and his voice had a gentle, curiously caressing quality. In the darkness it was impossible to distinguish his features in any detail. "It's a beautiful night," he told her. "Yes," she replied, stepping past him. "So lovely and calm." A courteous woman, she tried to give the impression of civility, while increasing the distance between them as swiftly as possible. "Good night," she added, half over her shoulder. She walked on, projecting her thoughts ahead of her to the cottage where supper and a new library book awaited her. As the man said, it was a beautiful evening, but for all that she might well put a match to the sitting-room fire. Her thoughts stopped abruptly as she became aware of the grass rustling behind her. She heard the soft rub of his clothes as he walked along, following in her footsteps. Involuntarily she quickened her pace. "Excuse me," he said again, "but do you live near here?" "Yes, no," she replied without turning her head. "No, I live in London." She hoped that he would note the dismissive quality in her tone and go away. The lane was very lonely. "I'd like to live in London," said the man in his soft, yearning voice. "Which part of it do you live in?" She didn't answer, but quickened her steps a little more. Her heart began to beat faster, though whether from exertion or apprehension she was unable to tell. "Please, talk to me," said the man. "Please tell me which part of London you live in." "Go away," she replied over her shoulder. "Please, go away and stop bothering me." Indignation began to mingle with apprehension, and she hurried along, straining her eyes through the brooding darkness. The man remained silent until she began to hope he had melted back into the woods as mysteriously as he had appeared. There wasn't very far to go now. "Please," he said suddenly, "please let me walk along with you. I've just done something terrible, and I've got to talk to someone." Fear prickled her skin. "Go away!" she cried, and turning her head caught a glimpse of his pale face glimmering a dozen paces behind her. He was walking quite silently. "I want to talk to you, but I have no intention of talking to you. Please," he said in the same yearning, clinging voice. "Please, dear, I promise I won't hurt you." Gripping her handbag firmly under her arm, she broke into a run, stumbling slightly as her foot caught in a tussock of grass. The cottage must be very near now, and she swerved suddenly from the soft verge and ran into the roadway, her heels clacking. Panting, she cursed the darkness and thought how disastrous it would be if, in her haste, she missed the cottage and ran past it. It lay somewhere on the other side of the lane, set in a tangled country garden behind a paling fence. "I won't hurt you, I only want to talk to you," went on the voice behind her, still about the same distance away. Its sad entreaty rang in her brain, filling her with a shuddering abhorrence. She became increasingly aware of a desperate need to escape. "I want to tell you something," came the man's voice, panting. "I want to tell you about poor Agnes." Unheeding, she ran on, and relief flooded through her as she saw the white palings of the cottage gleaming in the dark. Panting, she threw herself at the gate, which burst obligingly open, and as her tired legs carried her swiftly up the front path, her fingers closed on the door key that lay in her coat pocket. Fumblingly, she inserted it in the big old-fashioned lock. The door opened, and she rushed inside. Through the sobbing of her breath, she heard the man's feet thudding softly on the path behind her. Then she slammed the door loudly, triumphantly, and collapsed against it. She remained leaning there, her eyes closed, her heart pumping as if it would burst. She was safe. When the pounding of her heart had subsided a little, she went through into the sitting room, where she drew the curtains very closely before switching on the light. She sat down on the sofa and lit a cigarette with fingers that were still trembling. Tiredly she relaxed against the cushions, stretching her legs out in front of her. Unaccustomed to violent exercise, the muscles in them were still jumping and twitching as if in protest. The cottage was silent, safe. Little by little its peacefulness stole over her, and after a while she was able to regulate her breathing to the slow tick of the grandfather clock. She began to smile at the memory of her undignified flight through the darkness. He only wanted to talk to her, he said. Talk to her. About someone called Agnes. Crushing out her cigarette, she stood up, then struck a match and held it to the neatly laid wood fire. Smoke curled up from it. She took off her coat before going out to the kitchen to make the coffee for supper. She felt pleasantly hungry. The kitchen was across the hall at the side of the house, and she drew the gingham curtains before switching the kettle on to boil. Reaching for a fresh bottle of milk, she was half obscured by the fridge door when she heard a sudden, sharp click. Frozen into immobility, she remained crouching with the milk in her hand while she listened to the creak that told her someone had opened the back door. Fool. Fool, she'd forgotten to lock it before going to the pictures. "Hello?" the man's voice said gently. Sick at heart, she replaced the milk bottle in the fridge, closed the door, and turned round to face him. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. Seen in detail for the first time, he was a pale, rather delicate-looking man with thinning hair and a soft, full mouth. He was wearing canvas shoes, dark trousers, and a gabardine jacket buttoned closely at the neck. "I told you," he said, closing the door and leaning against it. "I've got to talk to you. I've got to tell you about something terrible I've just done." His voice cracked slightly, and with a quick movement he covered his face with one hand. Although his body appeared slight, his hands were wide and seemed to her as if they might possess an unusual strength. Her heart began to pound heavily. "I don't wish to hear it," she said. I don't know who you are, but you've no right to follow me, and you've certainly no right to come in here without being asked. If you don't go immediately, I shall phone for the police." With another abrupt movement, he uncovered his face and stood staring at her, a shrewd, calculating stare from which all entreaty had vanished. "He's mad," she thought incredulously. "He's escaped from somewhere." Behind her, the kettle began to sing. Without taking her eyes off him, she reached behind her and switched it off. Its little song died. "Get out," she said. "Get out!" "You're just like Agnes," he said, still staring. "Always angry." "Who is Agnes?" She asked the question involuntarily. "My wife." The hardness fell from his face, and his features appeared to crumple. She became freshly aware of his full, loose-lipped mouth. "Oh, my poor Agnes," he said. "I've harmed her. I've harmed her so badly." Blindly, he took a step forward into the kitchen, his hands outstretched as if he was feeling his way, and instantly her brave anger gave way to a rush of primitive terror. The man was a murderer. Somewhere, perhaps nearer than she knew, his wife was lying strangled or stabbed. Fragmentary pictures of nameless horror flashed through her mind, and almost of their own volition her legs carried her towards the door into the hall. Instantly he was after her, his canvas shoes squeaking on the tiled floor. With a sob she turned towards the staircase and bolted up it, 2 steps at a time, leaving one of her sandals behind. She heard him stumble over it. Upstairs the bedroom doors stood open, and she flung herself through the first one and crashed the door in his face. For a moment she felt his weight behind it on the other side and heard the soft gasp of his breath, but with a strength of desperation she held it closed. With her cheek pressed against the rough oak, she closed her eyes, and tears began to run down her face. "Go away," she prayed. "Please, please go away." Never before had she felt so bitterly conscious of the meaning of isolation. She began to listen, straining her ears to hear what he was doing on the other side of the door. She could hear nothing. Quickly she removed one hand from the door and wiped it across her wet cheeks before replacing it. Silence. She waited almost without breathing for the sound of a footstep, the creak of a floorboard that would betray his whereabouts. But the cottage was wrapped in utter stillness. Slowly and experimentally, she lessened her weight on the door, shifting her body so that only her hands and forearms were pressed against it. The door remained closed. With her eye, she measured the distance to the heavy chest of drawers that stood with its back to the same wall in which the door was set. No more than 7 or 8 feet, she calculated, and told herself that when she had counted 10, she was to run across to it and shunt it in front of the door. Gently working her other foot out of its sandal, she rehearsed the movement in her mind. 1, leave the door. 2, run to the chest. 3, push it towards the door. But which would be best? To push it or to pull it? And supposing she couldn't shift it? Closing her eyes, she began to count. 8, 9, 10. She sprang, slipping on the polished oak boards and grabbing at the chest as if it were a life belt. Thrusting her hip against it, she tried to move it. It refused to budge. She tried again, bending almost double and exerting every ounce of strength. Her heart seemed to fill her entire body with its rapid, unsteady beat. Protestingly, the chest gave a little squawk before beginning its journey to the door. 2 feet away, it stopped abruptly, and despite her frantic pushing, refused to move any more. Sobbing with frustration, she ran around to the other side and discovered that it had come hard up against an electric light point. Tugging and wrenching, she pulled it away from the wall, and it slid across to the door with an ease that was almost funny. With the chest in position, she became possessed of a demoniacal energy, pushing the single divan from its alcove and standing it in front of the chest, where she piled it up with chairs, the bedside table, and a bookcase. Even the rug she seized and flung on board, as if its added weight would help, and when there was nothing left save the curtains and pictures, she climbed onto the divan herself and sat there, exhausted, dishevelled, and grimly triumphant. The room she was in was not her own bedroom. Papered with roses in between the beams and with its dormer window swagged with frilled muslin, it had a white cupboard in the corner that contained the hot water tank, and she sat curled on the divan listening to the occasional gloop-gloop that came from it. To begin with, the sound of it breaking the stillness had exacerbated her nerves, but gradually she had grown to recognize it as a friendly domestic voice and her one remaining link with the normal world. There was no sound from the man, no creak or rustle, no hint as to his whereabouts. Rummaging through the books that had fallen from the bookcase onto the bed, she tried to read, but it was impossible to concentrate. She wished she knew the time. Chilled, she tucked the counterpane round her legs and wondered for the 100th time what the man was doing, whether he'd gone away, or whether he was sitting motionless outside the door, patient as a spider in a web. He was a maniac. On his own confession, he had done something unspeakable to his wife, and in an effort to blot out persistent visions of the body, she began counting the roses on the wallpaper. Then another thought struck her, jerking her upright. Now that she was barricaded securely in the bedroom, what was to stop the man from ransacking the place? Stripping it quietly and efficiently of its silver, its pieces of Bow and Chelsea china, the tiny antique silhouettes that hung in the hall. She'd left her handbag in the sitting room with her purse in it and her checkbook. Fresh horror filled her. It wasn't as if the cottage was hers. It had only been lent by a kind friend who trusted her, and here she was congratulating herself on her astuteness when, in reality, she'd done precisely what the man wanted her to do. Pushing the counterpane aside, she got off the bed and stood listening to the deep silence, then, leaning across the heap of furniture, switched off the light. Pulling back the muslin curtains, she opened the window to its widest extent, gazing apprehensively at the smooth expanse of thatched roof that gleamed dull gold in the starlight. Her only hope was to get out of the room silently so that she could creep into the sitting room and phone for the police. Quickly, before her courage wavered, she climbed onto the narrow sill and eased her body through the window. The night air struck cold, and somewhere close at hand a bird complained in its sleep. The thatch stretched below the dormer window, sloping quite gently until it ended above the sitting room, no more than 7 feet from the ground. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face the bedroom, then carefully lowered herself until she was hanging by her hands from the windowsill, the straw rough against her outstretched body. Her heart was beginning to pound again, and closing her eyes, she slowly relinquished her grip and started to slide down. As her progress quickened, she dug her fingers into the thatch, seeking desperately to prepare for the moment when the roof ended and she would have to fall. She fell. It happened quickly, and she lay huddled in the flower bed below the sitting-room window, listening and trying to regain her breath. She was unhurt. Cautiously, she stood up, conscious of the dew-damp soil on her stockinged feet. The sitting-room lamp still glowed softly behind the drawn curtains, and everywhere had the same sleeping stillness about it. Crouching against the wall, she crept round the corner of the cottage towards the back door. It was ajar, a pencil of light falling across the step. She pushed it a little wider and pressed her nose and one eye to the aperture. The kitchen was empty. She slipped inside and stood listening. No sound. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. She crept across to the door that led into the hall. There was no sign of him. Careful not to make a sound, she tiptoed into the sitting room and glided across to the table where the telephone stood. Even as her finger began to dial 999, she was still unable to grasp that the room was really empty of his presence. The only sounds were the whir of the phone's dial and the peaceful tick of the clock. The fire had settled low in the hearth, and her handbag still lay on the chair by her coat. The room was undisturbed. She dialed the third 9. "Don't do that, dear," he said gently, and the top of his head rose above the back of the settee. He stood up and came over to her, and as the operator's voice spoke, he placed his hand on hers and restored the receiver to its resting place. It gave a little click. The fight went out of her. Wearily, hopelessly, she leant against the wall and covered her face with her hands. "I loved Agnes," he said. "I really did." "Then why—" she began dully. "I stopped loving her because she was so cruel." They were sitting on either side of the dying fire, he huddled on the settee with his hands pressed between his knees, and she strained upright in the chair. Just let him talk, she thought. Humour him, agree with everything he says, and don't lose the slightest opportunity to get to the phone. But she felt desperately weary. "I couldn't help it," he said, staring down at his hands. "I just had to punish her." Very quietly she asked, "What did you do to her?" "Killed her," he said. To hear the words was almost a relief. At least, she thought, I know exactly where I stand. I am alone in an isolated cottage with a murderer. Aloud she said, "Will it help to tell me about her?" He clenched his hands, and the sudden crack of a finger joint made them both start nervously. "She was the wickedest woman on earth, dear," he said simply. "Cruel and tormenting like a cat. Everything I've ever loved she's taken from me and destroyed it, slowly and horribly, like a cat. That's the truth about Agnes. She's not a woman at all. She's a monstrous cat. And now I've killed her." His voice was quiet and unemotional, and despite her fear, he touched a chord of pity in her. She wished there was something she could do to help. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" she asked, and at once his eyes narrowed. "Why?" he demanded. She shrugged. "No particular reason. I just thought you might, that's all." Abruptly he rose to his feet. "All right," he said, "but I'll come with you." "Do as you please," she replied as unconcernedly as possible, and led the way. With an effort she held her head high. They were crossing the hall to go into the kitchen when the knock came on the front door. Involuntarily she cried out, and a few precious seconds were lost while she stood still, her tired mind unable to take in this new development. "Don't you open it!" he hissed, and his words galvanized her into action. She sprang forward, and as her hand touched the Yale, he gripped her shoulder and tried to drag her away. She bit him. They struggled, then the door swung open, and a woman in jeans and a headscarf stepped into the hall. She had a young, cheerful face. "Oh, gracious," she said. The man's hands fell to his sides. For a moment they all stood staring at one another. "Jimmy," said the strange woman gently. "Jimmy. Oh, I was afraid I might find you here. What have you been doing?" "Nothing," said the man. "I've told you before," went on the woman, "that you mustn't call on strangers like this. You must wait until you've been introduced." She smiled briefly, apologetically, and said, "I'm so sorry about this. My husband is rather, well, unconventional at times." Your Husband? The words seemed to catch in her throat. The woman smiled again, and her warm blue eyes twinkled with sudden friendliness. Yes, she said. I'm Agnes. The weight of weariness was so great that it was an effort to think clearly, let alone put thoughts into words. I'm Margaret Hope, she said falteringly, but I don't understand. Your husband's just been telling me that he's done something terrible to you. And so he has, replied Agnes, frowning at the man in mock severity. He's done something very terrible indeed. He's opened the cage doors and let all my chinchillas out. I breed them, you see. I've managed to catch 4 of them, but it's the devil's own job to track them all down in the dark, and by morning they'll be miles away. She sighed. Sometimes, Jimmy boy, she said, it's awfully hard to keep patient with you and your pranks. The man stood there, studying the toes of his canvas shoes. He said nothing. Come along, said Agnes, reaching for his hand. We've got to go now. We've already taken up a lot of this kind lady's time. Her face mirrored a friendly curiosity. You're only staying here, aren't you? Yes, she replied, for 2 more weeks. Oh, well, we live in the farmhouse on the other side of the wood, said Agnes. Why not stroll over and have a coffee with us one evening? Thank you, that would be very nice. Although her lips moved heavily, she was conscious of the unbearable weight of tension lifting. If she hadn't been so tired, she would almost have felt like laughing. The couple moved towards the open front door, Agnes leading the man by the hand. As he passed, he stopped and looked at her with his strange, sad eyes. I was only pretending this time, he said very quietly. But I will kill her one day. See if I don't. For a second, he and his wife stood holding hands, their arms outstretched like 2 people about to take a theatrical bow. Then the door closed behind them, and she collapsed against it, laughing and sobbing with relief. The poor, harmless man was suffering from delusions. How sad, and how adroitly his wife coped with him. It wasn't until she was in bed, almost asleep, that she remembered something. Startling as a flash photograph, she remembered seeing Agnes's hand on his, the fingers rigid, the nails biting into his palm with all the quiet and terrible venom of a cat's claws.
The Game by Judy Gardner. Read by Jenny Seagrove.
Travelling west along the A406, not far from Staples Corner, there are 3 sets of traffic lights within a short distance of one another. And it was at the first of these that Millie Ellenbogen was accustomed to lean from the passenger window and say in a little deadly voice to the driver on her left, "Please help me. I'm being kidnapped." Her husband, Forbes, had no knowledge of Millie's pastime because his mind was always occupied by A, driving, and B, work. He was a sedate man with small eyes, set closely in the shelter of a large nose, and he and Millie were partners in a modest business that supplied hotels and restaurants with table linen. Specialists in napery was how Forbes described it, and even referred to himself as a naperist, until someone at a party somewhere thought he said naturist and asked whether he was allowed to keep his watch on. He worked hard, much harder than Millie, who only accompanied him on his business trips as a means of escaping from the tedium of bookkeeping and letter typing. But the A406, with its gasworks and garbage, its factories and fumes, was merely exchanging one sort of tedium for another. And so Millie invented the game as a harmless way of alleviating it. Reactions varied. Some drivers didn't hear, some heard and refused to believe the evidence of their ears, while others, to judge from their sudden loss of road sense, heard and believed and didn't know what to do. These, obviously, were the ones who really made the game worthwhile. But the game ended on the day that Milly accosted the pockmarked man in the old black Studebaker. Bored with Forbes and hotel table linen and the hot stench of the A406, she directed her tremulous appeal through the open window and was gratified to see his eyes widen in horrified disbelief.
"God almighty, Baggy Aggie,"
he cried above the roar of revving engines.
"You're supposed to be in Pontefract."
"I've been kidnapped," Milly repeated with slightly less conviction and a little quieter.
"Who the hell's he?"
The man jerked his thumb at Forbes, who was stolidly preparing to engage first gear.
"I didn't catch his name,"
said Milly rapidly,
"but I think he's one of the other lot."
The lights changed, and the traffic zoomed. Vastly amused, Milly sat back and contemplated the thundering rear of a petrol tanker. The game had never worked so well before. At the next halt, the man pulled the Studebaker in close and leaned urgently from his window, his eyes darting nervously at Forbes.
"Listen, Bag. They made a mess of Harry.
Oh, dear.
17 stitches and a busted nose. They got him down at Lazy Maisie's."
Lazy Maisie, thought Milly delightedly, and Baggy Aggie. Poor man's completely mad. As the third set of lights turned to red, he drew level again.
"Bag,"
he said feverishly.
"If the West Ham crowd know you're back, they'll go over you. They'll go over you, Bag, same as they went over Harry."
"But you won't talk." It seemed a reasonable request. The man smiled.
"I only talk with this,"
he said, and with a smooth, almost imperceptible movement, slid the muzzle of a small revolver over the edge of the Studebaker's window.
"I'll see you right, Bag,"
he said through clenched teeth.
"Don't you worry. I'll see you right."
The lights turned green, and so did Milly. Suddenly, the game wasn't funny anymore. "I feel a bit sick," Milly ventured as they headed for Ealing. "Then why shut the window?" asked Forbes. "I felt cold." "Well, I can't stop here." "No, I don't want to." "Shall I turn off somewhere?" "Yes, no, I'll just keep going. I don't want a man in a black car to catch up with us." "What's this, some sort of game?" asked Forbes, increasing to 50 along a clear stretch of road. "In a way," said Milly, and managed a wan smile. But they reached Richmond without incident and without further sight of the Studebaker, the only black vehicle they encountered being a hearse. Milly began to relax very slightly. The Queen's Hotel overlooked the river, and before getting out of the car, she asked Forbes if he could arrange to park somewhere out of sight. "Now look," began Forbes, heaving the case of napery samples from the back seat. Then his expression softened. "If you're still feeling rotten, pop in the bar and have a brandy. I'll join you later." He walked off towards the manager's office. With a final hasty glance round, Milly slipped from the car and sped like an arrow into the hotel. At midday, the place was still rather empty, and she settled herself in an inconspicuous corner from which she could see the door. She ordered a double brandy, and then on second thoughts ordered one for Forbes as well. Several men came into the bar, but none of them was the pockmarked driver of the Studebaker. When Forbes came in search of her, he was smiling and rubbing his hands. 5 dozen double damask table napkins, he began, then stopped when he saw the waiting brandy. "Good Lord, did you order this for me?" Milly nodded mournfully. He sat down beside her. "In that case, cheers. Tell you what, why don't we have lunch here? We don't often treat ourselves, and life's only short, isn't it?" "Yes," said Milly. "It could end at any time." He studied her solicitously. "Don't still feel ill, do you?" "No," said Milly in a smothered voice. "Just a bit on edge." They went through to the dining room, and the pockmarked man wasn't in there either. It began to look as if they'd given him the slip after all. Heartened, Milly chose avocado, followed by canard à l'orange, while Forbes ordered half a bottle of wine. And halfway through the meal, the urge to confess suddenly overwhelmed her. "Forbes," she said, leaning across the table and looking deep into his eyes. "Sometimes I play a horrible sort of game with myself." "Oh?" The peas that Forbes had assembled carefully on his fork quivered inquiringly. I pretend that I'm being kidnapped, and I ask strange men to rescue me going along in the car. Why? I dunno, Forbes. It could lead you into trouble, he said at length. He already has, Milly said, and told him about the man in the Studebaker. A gun? Repeated Forbes. You dreamed it. I swear I didn't, she said. He kept calling me Baggy Aggie and going on about someone called Harry. Harry who? I dunno, but he got a lot of stitches and a busted nose. You dreamed it, Forbes repeated. And it's a sign that you need an outlet. Oh? I've often thought that travelling in Napier isn't enough for a creative person like you. You ought to go to evening classes or something. He poured the last of the wine, and it came to Milly then that she loved Forbes very much indeed. I've been a fool. No, you haven't, he said, taking her hand and stroking it. Before I became a middle-aged bore, I used to pretend that I was John of Gaunt. Soothed and smoothed by good food and wine, Milly walked slowly towards the hotel car park, while Forbes went to the gents. The sunlight was blinding, and she shaded her eyes while she looked round at the other cars. There was no black Studebaker among them, but she no longer expected that there would be. The game had crumbled, because the need for it had crumbled. Looking back across the car park for Forbes, she put her hand on the car door and was startled when it flew open, almost knocking her off her feet. Before she could utter a word, someone had grabbed her elbow and dragged her inside. The door slammed, the engine roared, and they were away, sending up a vicious spray of gravel behind them.
You didn't think I'd let you down, did you, Bag?
Asked the man with the pockmarked face. Driving Forbes' car swiftly and competently through the traffic, he gave Milly a loving grin.
I phoned Harry while you were eating. He's waiting for you down at Maisie's place. We'll be there about 4, I told him.
Milly made an inarticulate sound, grabbed the steering wheel and grazed the side of a bus.
You're all het up, the man said soothingly. And no wonder with you and Harry being apart so long. How long did you say you've been married to him?
They came to a halt at the traffic lights. Taking a deep breath, Milly rolled the window down and fixed the man in the next car with a desperate eye.
Please help me,
she said in a small, deadly voice.
I'm being kidnapped.
The car was a Mercedes, and the blue-chinned driver flicked her a bored glance. You don't say, he said, and then turned off left towards Hampton Court.
Overtime by Paul Finch. Read by Brian Blessed.
Detective Constable Harry Jenks knew that things weren't going well between himself and the DCI when he was given to Area for a weird job on the Bannerfields estate. There were 3 particular things he didn't fancy about that one. First of all, Area. The polite face of the job, the community department who dealt mainly with noisy neighbours and little old ladies who had no one else to talk to. Since when did they need CID, unless it was some real ball acher? Secondly, weird job. Anything classed as weird in this town would have to be well off the beaten track. And thirdly, the Bannerfields estate. It was mostly ash and brick dust now, a flattened desert of rubble in the heart of the city redevelopment scheme. There couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 houses left standing. As it turned out, there were less than that. When Harry pulled up on Laburnum Grove that Monday morning, he found himself beside a 2-house end of terrace in the middle of a virtual wasteland. Charlie Fishwick, the young area PC for the district, was standing on the pavement, as always, immaculate in his uniform and grinning broadly. He was young for an area copper, but apparently he got on with people and had made the job his own. The detective climbed from the CID car. It was a cold, grey February day, and he quickly pulled his Mac on. Charlie strode over to him, hands behind his back. "Morning, Harry. Must have really stepped out of line to land this job." Harry grunted. "Just don't talk to me about it. What's all this, anyway?" Charlie looked unsure. "I think ghosts." Harry gave him a blank look, and the PC began a long-winded and rather vague explanation. He turned to the houses, both sorely dilapidated, and told how the tenants, Mr. Codswell and Mrs. Casey, had reported odd sounds. "That's a CID job," said Harry. "Odd sounds." Charlie cleared his throat self-consciously. "Well, I asked for CID, actually, Harry. I'm not happy about this arrangement, to be honest. Codswell in one house, he's an ex-druggie. The old girl in the next, and no one else within miles of them. I'm beginning to wonder what's going on." This sounded more interesting. "Well, let's go and ask him," said Harry. The PCs stepped back and let the older man lead the way. Harry Jenks was not an impressive sight, overweight, scruffy, and with a permanent hangdog expression, but his reputation as a hardened thief-taker was set in stone, and most impressionable young career bobbies had time and respect for him, even if his supervisors didn't. The men upstairs reckoned his methods were outdated and attitude prehistoric, and had made that quite clear by letting him reach 42 without showing any signs of promoting him. Now, that didn't worry younger bobbies like Charlie. It kept Harry one of the lads, which was the way they liked him best. The doorbell had been ringing for nearly a minute when Codswell finally answered. Instinctively, Harry didn't like him. The tenant had the shriveled physique and sunken cheeks of a sick man. He wore shabby trousers, slippers, a string vest and an old cardigan, and had let his greying hair grow thick and unruly. Stubble covered his jaw. He gazed at the detective suspiciously, even after Harry introduced himself and showed his warrant card. "It's about these queer noises, Mr. Codswell. I think it's time we cleared them up, don't you?" Codswell shrugged and led the two policemen inside. The house was in a grim state. Carpets thick with crumbs, walls of bare plaster, furniture filled with holes and broken springs, ceilings damp and green with mould. Codswell offered the two men a cup of tea, but they politely declined. They sat down in the lounge, and Harry looked at the former addict hard. After a second, he began to twitch about uncomfortably. "Well?" he asked them, his voice a nervous croak. Good, Harry thought. He was ready. "What are these funny sounds you've been reporting, Mr. Codswell?" The man shrugged. "Well, I told your mate here, groans, like horrible groans, chains rattling." Harry lifted an eyebrow. "Chains rattling, eh?" "Yeah, real ghost stuff." Harry asked him how long he'd been hearing them for, but Codswell struggled to answer. After a minute or so, he explained that he'd only been off smack a year. He was still on methadone, but they were bringing his dosage down. He suddenly looked up with hunted eyes. Until recently, he said, he hadn't realised that he was hearing anything at all. He hadn't screwed his head up, had he? Harry said that they'd try to find out. A minute later, the two officers were outside again, ringing the bell next door. "He's in a bad way, that one," Charlie commented. "He's also a scrounging toe-rag," said Harry. "Probably specialises in self-pity. See all the benefits forms on his mantelpiece? He's not so washed up. Chains rattling, I ask you." Mrs. Casey was altogether different. Her house was spotless and smelled sweetly of sandalwood. Her lounge carpet neatly swept. There were ornaments arranged sensibly on the sideboard, and Harry noticed 2 sepia snapshots at either end of the television top. Both were handsomely framed, and each one portrayed a serviceman. One man seemed older than the other, but they grinned pleasantly into the room, faces stark over their dark uniforms. "Mrs. Casey's husband and son," Charlie whispered quietly, while the old lady busied herself in the kitchen, getting some tea things together. "Both killed during the war. The man at sea, the boy at Dunkirk." Mrs. Casey came back in, beaming, but she showed her age. Her kindly face was a myriad of wrinkles, her hair grown thin and white. She poured their tea steadily and handed it over in fragile-looking cups and saucers. "I can only say, Constable," she began, "that I haven't really been disturbed at all. The poor man next door, Mr. Codswell, he's been to see me about it twice. I can't say I've been able to help him." "You've heard nothing at all, ma'am?" Harry asked. She mused for a moment. "Well, I have heard the odd noise, a sighing or groaning, I suppose, but I must confess I always thought it was Mr. Codswell himself. He hasn't been at all well, you know." Harry was surprised. "You can hear him through this wall?" Mrs. Casey smiled. "These houses are very old, Constable. The walls very, very thin." Harry looked at the neatly papered wall. He imagined the former drug addict on the other side of it, ear pressed against the cracking plaster, taking in every word. "Mr. Codswell thinks it's ghosts," he said loudly. To his surprise, however, the old lady tittered. "Oh, dear me, Constable. Ghosts? Well, when you reach my age, it's the living ones you've got to be worried about." Charlie sniggered. Harry's smile was false, however. "You have heard something, though?" he asked again. "Strange sounds?" The old lady nodded. "I'm not frightened of it, though. It doesn't frighten me at all." A few minutes later, the two coppers were strolling up the cobbled alley behind the house. The line of buildings on the other side of it had long been demolished, but incongruously, the brick toilets, which had once stood at the end of their backyards, remained, a row of roofless, tumble-down shacks. Harry shuddered. What a place for an old lady to be spending her final years in. Charlie shrugged. As far as he knew, she'd been offered a price for her house several times, but had opted to stay on. "She's a tough one," he said. Harry nodded. When she said she wasn't frightened, she clearly meant it. He supposed that to someone who'd lost both son and husband in the same war, probably never knowing the full details but imagining the worst, ghost stories seemed like childish fantasies. They walked to the end of the row, then back again. Charlie glanced into the outbuildings one by one. Most had been derelict for years. They were deep in weeds and rubble. A chill breeze came up, setting the loose timbers creaking. It suddenly seemed that they were a long way from anywhere. "You know," the PC began, "this neighbourhood has a tragic history. It was heavily bombed during the war. One night, a German Messerschmitt crash-landed around here on its way back from a raid, flattened about 6 houses, burned everyone inside them to a crisp. They spent hours trying to identify the bodies, but a lot of people were left unaccounted for, including the pilot. Bloody awful." Harry looked at him. "You're not trying to tell me you think it really is haunted?" Charlie shrugged. Then they heard the groan. A long, drawn-out human groan, which seemed to rise from the bowels of the earth. It ended almost abruptly as it started. Both men turned sharply, but behind them the back street was empty. Nothing moved on the wasteland or in between the ruined outhouses. The hairs on the nape of Harry's neck were suddenly prickling. He glared up at Codswell's windows, but they were all firmly closed, the curtains drawn. The attic's back gate hung from its hinges, clearly showing nobody in his yard. "What time do you get off duty, Charlie?" the detective finally asked in a quiet voice. 3. I'm on again tomorrow." Harry shook his head. "I want you on tonight. All night. Civvies. We'll pay the overtime." Later that afternoon, Harry called in at the local RC church to see the parish priest, who turned out to be a helpful elderly man. He'd been in the parish for several decades and did recall something vaguely disturbing at Laburnum Grove, he said. It was an old story, though, rumours of haunting following multiple fatalities during a bombing raid in the war. Hadn't some German aircraft come down on the street? Harry confirmed that the story was true. For some reason, the priest then grinned. The parish authorities had never taken the tales very seriously, as he recalled. Reports had come in from various people, but all referred to groans, screams, and the rattling of chains. Harry felt a chill creep down his spine. The priest was quite amused by it, however. A sort of textbook ghosts, as he put it. All very odd, but hardly believable. If the spirits of the dead could really come back, would they honestly try to make contact by rattling chains? It was straight out of Dickens. Preposterous. Early the next morning, as he slumped in sweater and jeans in the front of the CID car, drinking cold coffee and watching the houses on Laburnum Grove, Harry still hadn't made up his mind. Charlie, also kitted out in plain clothes, was beside him, snoring loudly. They'd been taking it in turns to watch, but it was now dawn, and a pale, mist-shrouded one at that, and neither had seen anything suspicious. What would someone want to scare two people out of two rubbish houses like that for? The detective wondered aloud as he nudged his psychic awake. Charlie yawned, then rubbed his cramped and frozen joints. I don't think it's Codswell any more, then. Harry wasn't sure. There's definitely no demolition order on these properties yet? They're not holding up the redevelopment scheme or something? Charlie said no. He'd already checked all that. Harry thought again about the blood-curdling groan in the empty back street. Even in broad daylight it had spooked him. But he couldn't get out of his mind what the priest had said. Textbook ghosts. It was like fairies with butterfly wings or witches with broomsticks and warts on their noses. Surely if someone was trying to scare those people, they'd be a bit more original. But then again, they were only copying a local legend. 9 o'clock finally came, the sun rising like a cold jewel in the ashen sky, and Charlie asked when they were knocking off. At first, Harry didn't answer. Then suddenly, he sprang into life, leaping from the car. "Come on," he said, over his shoulder. "We're having another word with Codswell." Charlie stumbled wearily after him, asking why. Harry said it was just a gut feeling he had. When the PC pointed out that Codswell was actually the complainant, the detective felt his suspicions crystallise. "For some reason, he wants that old lady out from next door," he said, ringing Codswell's bell hard. He'd heard the old stories and thought he'd shift her that way. What he didn't bargain for is that, nice though she is, she's too deaf or too dizzy to notice. So he did the next best thing. He involved us, hoping we'd get the message through to her. Codswell finally came to the door, wrapped in an indecently short dressing gown. Charlie cringed at the sight of old bruises on his legs and arms, needle tracks. Perhaps Harry was right. A man who would do that to himself was capable of anything. Initially, they didn't accuse him, however. After all, even if it was him, he'd committed no crime. The detective adopted a tougher line, though. He'd done some checking on Mr. Codswell. "When did you first report these noises?" he asked. 3 months ago, I think." "Yet you've been clean and living here and claiming invalidity payouts and such for over a year. So what? As well as drugs, you've got convictions for dishonesty, haven't you? What are you accusing me of? Lies and deceptions come easy to you, don't they? I'm telling you, I heard those noises. A good spot for someone with your background, this, isn't it? Lonely, quiet, bloody inconvenient that the old girl being there, though, eh?" And so it went on for minutes. Eventually, the detective stepped back and let Charlie in, the younger man trying the softly approach. Still, Codswell insisted that everything he told them was true. "All right, look," he suddenly said, "so I might have taken a bit of extra stuff now and then." "Broke your parole, you mean?" said Charlie. "Only a bit, mind. I'm off it now. It just took me a bit longer than I was letting on." He looked at them with his pallid, sickly face. "Don't you understand? That's why I've only just started getting it together again. That's why I didn't notice anything until a few months back." All of a sudden, Harry felt tired. He glanced out of the window to see Mrs. Casey leaving her house with a shopping basket. She was dressed in a heavy coat and prim little hat, but when she looked round and spotted the CID car, he was surprised to see a hard, irritable expression on her face. Stiffly, she walked away. Suddenly, something the old woman had said came back to him. "I'm not frightened of it. It doesn't frighten me at all. It. It was possible she'd been using a figure of speech, but when most people discuss something vague like this, they refer to ghosts rather than a ghost. The use of the singular it would normally be a positive expression reserved for a specific defined thing. A thing you knew about in some detail. Quickly, Harry took Charlie to one side and said he was nipping out. He told him to keep at Codswell, but to lighten up a bit, eh? The poor guy was still half asleep. The PC stared after him in disbelief. Mrs. Casey shuffled along slowly, and the detective had no trouble keeping up, but it was not a particularly exciting trip. She walked up several demolished streets and turned in at the first corner shop she came to. Charlie left Codswell's house several minutes later. It was more an embarrassed retreat than anything else, and he felt mildly annoyed with Harry. He rang next door, but nobody answered, so he wandered round the back. In the milky light of morning, the derelict alley and the fields of rubble had a particularly desolate feel. He remembered that eerie groan, and wondered if this was the exact spot where the Messerschmitt had crashed. It was not a pleasant thing to ponder on, so he entered Mrs. Casey's backyard and knocked on the door. It creaked open. Charlie stood back. Somehow, not bothering to put the latch on, even in this day and age, was easy to imagine of Mrs. Casey. She had a sturdy independence about her. Then again, maybe it was just that she was inside. If she was, it was very quiet, however. After a second, he stepped in. Harry was standing idly by a street corner when Mrs. Casey re-emerged from the shop and set off home again. Her bag was now laden with goods. He watched her carefully. This whole thing was ridiculous, of course. No crime had been committed. Nothing out of the ordinary was going on. What was he doing here? He went into the shop anyway. He was following his sixth sense, like he always did. That's what he was doing. Charlie moved slowly from room to room in Mrs. Casey's house. All the curtains were still drawn, and it was surprisingly dark. He stumbled once and knocked a lamp over, and was now beginning to worry that he'd forced entry and was making an illegal search. What really concerned him, though, was the presence he could sense in that tiny terraced house. Somebody was in there, he was sure, waiting in the dark, listening. That was when he heard the first groan, long and agonized, and the faint clinking of chains. The sweat froze on Charlie's brow. It was somewhere close by, and was drawing steadily nearer. Harry found the man in the corner shop quite chatty. Yes, he'd known Mrs. Casey for a good many years now. She'd lived there since the war. Poor old thing, though. She had it rough, losing her son and husband. That had really hurt her. Harry nodded and backed from the shop. Of course, she'd never been short of companionship, with all those cats. Harry looked back. What cats? The one she buys for, the man said. The one she's came in for this morning. Buys a dozen tins of cat food a week. Always has. Harry dashed from the shop. Charlie was cowering between an armchair and a French dresser. The incessant groans were rising up all around him. Never had he heard such misery and wretchedness in a voice, yet there was no sign of the sufferer. He was there with him, though, in that very room, close. Charlie buried his head in his hands. Then somebody came in through the front door. The chorus of lamentation ended abruptly. Charlie looked up, soaked with sweat. Suddenly he knew that he couldn't be found there. He scrambled to his feet and dashed into the kitchen. It sounded like the old lady was right behind him. She was only feet from the kitchen door. In fact, if he went outside, she'd see him through the window. With less than a second to decide what to do, he ripped the curtain back on the kitchen alcove and leapt inside, quickly drawing it again. For breathless seconds he stood among the mops and brooms, his eyes slowly penetrating the old material. He saw Mrs. Casey come in and lay out several tins of what looked like pet food on her draining board. She took a tin opener from a drawer, an old-fashioned one with a large hook blade, and began to work on them. Charlie watched her, fascinated. Then he sensed, rather than heard, the muffled movement somewhere behind him. His spine crawling, the PC turned to look. He barely noticed that he'd knocked a mop over. He barely noticed the curtain being drawn back. For some reason, Mrs. Casey didn't seem surprised to find him there. "You naughty, sneaky man," she said. Then she plunged the tin opener into his chest. It punched a deep hole between his ribs, and Charlie gasped in shock, clawing at it as the blood pumped freely out. Mrs. Casey watched him dispassionately as he collapsed among the buckets and dustpans. Then she stepped over him. He was vaguely aware of her taking a key out of her pinafore pocket and putting it in the lock of a narrow door at the back of the alcove. She opened it, and a vile stench wafted out. "You naughty, sneaky man," the old lady told him again. Then she lifted the tin opener above her head, this time in both hands, as if for a final downward thrust. And Harry leapt onto her from behind. She squawked in rage as he wrestled the bloody weapon from her and hustled her away. Charlie rolled sideways to avoid their kicking feet. Before him lay a gulf of blackness. "Don't look down there, Charlie!" he heard Harry shouting. "You really don't want to!" He couldn't help it, though. He was going into shock, but he had to see first. Stone steps ran down into a cellar, now faintly lit from the light in the kitchen and strewn in decaying filth. Seconds before he passed out, he realized that at the bottom of those steps, a figure was lying prone. A figure of sticks, with a shriveled turnip for a head. A scarecrow, he thought, puzzled. But no, it was moving slightly. And why put chains on the feet of a scarecrow? Or dress it in what looked like an ancient flying suit? Or give it an armband? An armband, wearing the distinct but faded sign of the swastika.
Confession Time by Stella Whitelaw, read by June Whitfield.
Janet sat stiffly on the edge of the hard plastic chair, nervously twisting her handkerchief. She'd never been in a police interview room before. "It was me," she said in a low voice. "I killed that old man. He didn't deserve to live any longer." "Oh, yeah?" Detective Inspector Cruz looked at her suspiciously. She was a small woman, neatly dressed in a grey skirt and jumper, a patterned scarf at her neck. "How did you kill him?" "He was an unpleasant old man, always trying to talk to young girls. I didn't like him. He never washed." "He lived alone," said Detective Inspector Cruz. "He did his best." "As I said, he got on my nerves, so I killed him." "How, Mrs. Price?" "I strangled him," said Janet. "It didn't take me long. He was frail." "Take her away," he sighed to the WPC. "A waste of time. I've got better things to do than listen to your fantasies, Mrs. Price." "But aren't you going to arrest me?" she said anxiously. "No, I'm not. That old man was stabbed to death, and the house ransacked. Now take yourself home and don't bother me again." He slammed out of the room. "You ought to see a doctor," said the policewoman kindly. "It might help to talk to someone." "I did kill him," Janet protested. Out in the street, she felt the afternoon sunshine on her face. She had a lot to do before she went home: shopping, library and the dry cleaners. She'd better hurry in case for once her husband came home early. It was nearly a month before she returned to the police station and walked up to the desk. "May I speak to someone?" she said to the sergeant. "It's about that murder of a woman found in Wentworth Road yesterday. I did it." "One moment, madam," said the sergeant, reaching for the telephone. He rang through to CID. Detective Inspector Cruz nearly spilt his black coffee. "Oh, Lord, it's that woman again. She's come to confess to another murder. This time I'm going to tell her straight." Janet waited in the same bare interview room, patting her hair tidy. The detective burst in and shuffled papers in a bulky file to look busy. "Now, Mrs. Price, I haven't much time. What do you want to tell me?" "It's about that young woman killed in Wentworth Road. It was in the papers this morning. I killed her. I did, really," Janet said timidly. "Why?" "She was up to no good, wandering about at that time of night. She deserved all she got." "How did you kill her?" "I stabbed her." "How was she dressed?" "Oh, well, it was dark and a very short skirt and boots, I think."
As it happens, she was a nurse coming off night duty. She was hit on the head with a blunt instrument and she was wearing trousers. I am going to suggest you see a psychiatrist. I ought to charge you with wasting police time, but I am going to be lenient. Yes, it was a blunt instrument, Janet went on, as they made an appointment for her at a psychiatric hospital. I remember, a short, blunt instrument. Make that woman stay out of my sight, the detective growled as Janet left, and that's an order. She had been keeping the appointments with the psychiatrist. They had chatted together about her lonely childhood. It was a treat to spend time talking to someone about herself. Her husband was not interested at all. He hardly noticed her. When they found the body of Fiona Turner floating face down in the canal, the police expected Janet to turn up on their doorstep. "Hello, Mrs. Price," said the desk sergeant, recognising her a few days later. "Come to confess?" "It's important I speak with someone," she said, twisting her gloves. 5 minutes later, the detective marched into the room. "This has got to stop, Mrs. Price," he warned. "I don't want to hear any more cock and bull stories." "But I did murder her," said Janet sharply. "I did. You've got to believe me. I met her at the supermarket. I'd seen her there before. I offered her a lift because it was raining. When we got near the canal, I hit her on the head and pushed her in. Then I drove home." "Why did you do this?" said the detective, looking at his watch. "Because she was a fool. She was up to something. She deserved it." "Right on 2 counts this time, Mrs. Price. Miss Turner was hit on the head and did drown after being left unconscious in the water. Both facts were reported in the newspapers, but how did you get her along the path and into the canal? She was a robust woman, at least 11 stone. You're small and slim, so how?" "On a supermarket trolley," said Janet triumphantly. "I laid her over the trolley and wheeled her there." "And why did you cut off all her hair before you pushed her into the canal?" the detective asked her. "Because that's what they did to traitors in the war. Cut off their hair, and then I threw it in the water." "Mrs. Price," said the detective wearily, "Miss Turner was found with a full head of red hair. Go home and leave me alone." "Very well," said Janet meekly. "You've been very kind." "Are you still keeping your appointments at the hospital?" he asked, regretting his anger. "Oh, yes. They're kind to me, too." She went out into the street and walked towards her parked car. She must return the shopping trolley, still hidden in the boot, and give the upholstery another clean. The tyre lever was at the bottom of the canal a mile downstream. The weapon could never be traced to her. She had a lot to do before her husband came home. He'd be back early with no curvaceous redhead to keep him late at the office. Janet tore up the photograph she'd found of him and Fiona Turner looking lovingly into each other's eyes. She made a small funeral pyre of the pieces and set fire to them, smiling to herself. Confession was good for the soul.